Who wrote, Big Smiles asks, who wrote the Old Testament, the really odd stuff, before the Jewish writings? Let me throw this up here again, just because it might be a good conversation here. Not the odd stuff, the old stuff. Who wrote the Old Testament, the really old stuff before the Jewish writings, not the odd stuff? Some might say it's odd. So depends on which time period. So you're saying before the Jewish writings. So you're saying essentially before the state of Israel, which started with Moses. Okay, who wrote all the parts before Moses? Perhaps is what you're saying. Well, Moses did. Moses did. Jesus himself even says Moses did. There's a lot of Christians who think, well, I don't think Moses did. Jesus said so. So you're a Christian, you're kind of... Moses did. How did Moses write it? He wasn't there. Well, good question. God told him, just like any prophet. Moses is considered a prophet. And so God, who was there, was an eyewitness to all the things, creation and everything else. He told Moses, everything that happened with Abraham prior to Moses. God told him. On the side in case of a flank. Now that's actually a big question that, like I alluded to, there's a lot of people who would disagree with that. There's a lot of people who would say, no, Moses couldn't possibly have written that. He's not educated. They didn't have that sort of thing back then. Christians. We'll get arguments with Christians over it. Which, again, as I said, Jesus gives Moses credit, so it's a silly thing for Christians to do, but it is certainly there. And so what do? Well, we look at the textual evidence, the evidence within the manuscripts we have. We don't have originals. There are no originals of any ancient document. What the question is, well, how many copies do you have, and how close to the original is that copy? So how reliable is your copy? The Bible has more and is closer to the original than any other ancient document in all of human history. So if it's ever a question of is the Bible itself reliable, well, it's definitely more reliable than Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, any of those. Caesar. We have more copies of the New Testament than we have of Shakespeare. So like Shakespeare's copies, none of the copies match. We don't have original manuscripts, but none of his copies match. So when you read Shakespeare in school, you were reading a hybrid, a amalgamism or whatever it is, where they mash all the copies together and come up with like the most average example. And so that's essentially what's going on there. So anyway, when we look at the textual evidence, we see that the writings in Genesis and things like that, they're written by somebody who would be educated, and Moses would be uniquely positioned because he would have been educated in Pharaoh's court. He would have been raised to be potentially the next Pharaoh. So he's an educated individual. And then when you get to things like the Exodus, which is Moses' story, it's eyewitness accounts. He's including details of things that somebody who's just writing it later, a campfire story, like these are not details that you would include if it's just folktale. He's including things like that. And so basically, when you use the same literary rules that we would apply to anything in all ancient writings, it comes up as the most reliable historical document. And so Moses being credited as the author is the most plausible explanation. And if you're a Christian, it's definitely the explanation because Jesus is the one who says he did. There are similar stories in earlier time periods in Mesopotamian cultures. You didn't know if you used what was already there. So you're probably referring to, like, for example, the flood legends. And so you're probably referring to the flood legends and stuff like that in the ancient Mesopotamian cultures. So again, let's use the position, just for the sake of argument, the position that the Bible is correct, okay? If so, the Bible does say that after the flood, everyone lived all together in the same place for the next couple hundred years. So you've got the Tower of Babel. They lived in the city that they built there, even though God had said you need to scatter and go do these things. And the Tower of Babel, there's a whole lot of incorrect understanding about that. It was not a let's try to actually reach heaven. It was a ziggurat. It was essentially, we will make heaven ourselves. We will be like God. It's the same problem we were having earlier. Man wants to create their own version of religion, of their own belief. And so they create the Tower of Babel, and then God says that's not going to fly, and he scatters them. Okay? So now they go all to the uttermost ends of the earth. And we can talk about why if you want. But if that's the case, let's just run with it. That's the scenario. If that's the case, and you got all these people who scatter out, Mesopotamia being the oldest of those cultures, and then they continue to scatter out. They go to all different directions. If that's the case, what would be the thing you would expect them to have in their legends, their stories, their heritage? They'd probably all talk about the single hugest, most important thing that's happened in all of mankind so far, which was the flood. And it's interesting that in all corners of the earth, every ancient culture has a flood legend. Some people say, well, that's just proof that the Bible made it up. No, that's just proof that what the Bible said happened actually happened, because then the people scattered and took that legend with them. They took campfire stories, so they're not identical. They did get embellished here and there or changed here and there. And so instead, when Moses is writing he's not writing a campfire story. He's actually writing God's eyewitness account of the events. Again, from the perspective of a Christian, from the perspective of this is the actual events. And so that would be why. He's writing what God's eyewitness account of the event is, as opposed to taking from the cultures around him. It's really the opposite. The cultures around them are having a skewed view of something that actually happened in their history. They just all have that common denominator of this really happened. There's flood legends. We can run with this. There's the same reason why there's dragon legends in every culture around the world. Why? Because they were dinosaurs, and everyone has these legends of them. Everyone has legends of the flood. It's fascinating. We basically can boil it all down to one common denominator, which would be that family starting that first city after the flood. So it's a retelling of what older material? I really need to... Yeah, so if hopefully we're all understanding each other correctly. So yeah, it would be that the Mesopotamian legends, Moses is not inspired by those. They are being inspired by campfire stories that had been passed on from an actual event. They all share the same event. It's just Moses gets the eyewitness account to tell how it actually happened. Again, from the perspective that the Bible is correct and God is really real and all these things. That would be the Christian perspective. Hopefully that helps. Dragon fossils yet? No, but we have dinosaur fossils. The word dinosaur was invented in the 1800s. There was no word for dinosaur prior to that. But they had a whole lot of really big, really scary lizard bones that they're looking at. And so, what do we call these things? I don't know, let's call them dragons. Sure, that sounds like a good name. And so, universally, that's what they're called. We came up with dinosaur later, but it's been dragon throughout human history. Now, if you were to... The conversation we're having, I like talking dinosaurs. I was one of the kids growing up. I absolutely loved everything to do with dinosaurs. If we take that conversation to its conclusion, then the conclusion is dinosaurs were on the ark. Man lived alongside dinosaurs, according to the Bible, and they were on the ark. They just died off because the new environment the dinosaurs couldn't survive in the new environment. But it doesn't mean that God didn't preserve them all. He said to everything. They were included. And so the more modern post-diluvian, post-flood cultures, they all got to see these dinosaurs. It's fascinating. There are actual Renaissance, medieval accounts, eyewitness accounts of dragons, dinosaurs. Of course, dinosaur didn't exist until the word didn't exist until 1800s. And again, people are like, nah, but look it up. It's there. Why did they hate dragons but not giants? So the humans were only Noah and his family. If there's different interpretations, if you're referring to the Genesis 6 sons of God, which there is a interpretation where those were giants. If you see that as giants, then they're just really big humans, and they weren't part of. They didn't want to go on the ark. Like Noah, it calls him a prophet in his time, so he's presumably telling people, and they just don't want to come. And so the giants don't want to come. Plus, it's recorded as they were like the evil people. So they're humans, but only Noah and his family go on the ark. We have giants later. We have giants after the flood. So there's giantism. There's also a different interpretation that those weren't necessarily giants, but entirely different things. Hybrid human demon beings. Like that's pretty wild. That sort of thing. The Nephilim. They were allowed on but didn't want to go. So there's some disagreement, right? Like this would be one of those things that we just wish we wish we had more information, we just don't have it, right? So grain of salt, all that. Noah is told to make an ark for 2 of every kind of every creature, and for him and his family. The dimensions have been proven to be sufficient for exactly that. Okay, you don't have to bring full-size animals. You can bring babies. You can bring hibernating things. You can bring eggs. You don't have to bring the full size of everything. So if you're picturing that giraffe sticking its neck out the window and the elephant falling off the side, like that's not what he would have brought. They also don't have to eat nearly as much when they're young. So we can do that. Also, they would be 2 of every kind, not every individual species. So you only need 1 dog. You don't need all 50 gazillion breeds of dog. You just need 1 dog that has within it the genetic code of all the 50 breeds that we've developed since then. Same for every kind of animal. So you can further reduce the species down, and then essentially you actually have more than enough room. So you'd actually end up, if you do the math, if you do all of that, and you're like, okay, if we bring it down to kinds, we bring it down to young, we do all that, the ark would have had 3 layers, 3 floors. You'd have a floor dedicated for food and stuff. They're on there for over a year. Not 40 days. It rained for 40 days. They're on it for over a year until the water settled down. You got 1 floor for the animals, and then you actually have a whole floor for Noah and his family. That's a lot for 8 people. Maybe after a year it's not so much, but technically it's a lot for 8 people. It also says, as I mentioned, Noah was a prophet of his time, and so the understanding is he told people about it and there would have been room, and they didn't believe him. Do we know that for sure? No, we don't know that for sure. That they just didn't want to go. But that's the understanding. Is the Ark in Kentucky the real deal? So the Ark in Kentucky was built as a museum to help people understand what the Bible says about the Ark. So it's not. It is built to scale. That is the scale that the Bible says. So if you were to look at pictures or all of it, that would be the scale. It's massive, right? But of course, people jab fun at it all the time because if it floods or something like that, that's not going anywhere. Well, yeah, it's a museum. It's meant to be a building. It's not meant to be a boat. So fair enough. But if you go, you'll actually get to see how all of the stuff would really fit. It would legitimately fit in there. And so there is that. You live like 20 minutes. Have you ever gone? I've not been. I've looked at all the information. I've watched videos. I've done all these things. I've just never been. You gotta go check it out. Even if you need to, go as a skeptic. Ask the hard questions. Yeah. But it's as far as like the dimensions and everything, if you're curious at all, check it out, because for so long Christianity has basically presented this picture of the ark as basically a floating bathtub with all the animals falling out, And you would be right to say that's ridiculous. The thing is, until you actually put the Bible's dimensions of what it says together, until you actually look and say, oh yeah, it actually could do the job, you're going to have this mental picture of a joke, right? And so most people think of it as a joke, but it really isn't. Those are the dimensions that the Ark in Kentucky is built to. And so it's showing that this is plausible. So if you want to go and just ask the tough questions, do it. Like they actually invite that. They want people to come in who genuinely want to know what are the actual like Bible's arguments for these things, because it might seem silly to them or whatever. So yeah, I encourage you, check it out. Make a day of it. Bring the family. I'm afraid if I went, I'd be one of those obnoxious tourists who's like trying to tell everyone around him all the things, and they're just like, "Come on, guy, like you don't work here." I'd be one of those probably. But monkey, yeah, that is true. But so if somebody's going to be skeptical about what the Bible says on various things, the Ark, it gets a lot of press, if you will, but it has a lot of other major claims that can put that to shame, right? But it does become like a focal point. A lot of people have a lot of questions about it, so it is worth looking into. The primary miraculous thing in the Bible, the primary claim the Bible makes, that somebody needs to make a decision on whether or not they believe any of this stuff to be true, is Jesus himself. Did he rise from the dead? If he doesn't rise from the dead, he's just a man. He's just a guy. He's not God. And so that hinges the entire message of the Bible is on that miracle, not on what you believe about the boat. And so, there's a whole, like, that's the conversation to have. Yes, so you're Catholic and you appreciate we're defending Christianity on Twitch. Yeah, I mean, we're at least having conversations, absolutely. And as I've kind of presented here, I have a young Earth view. They have found not just T-Rex, but T-Rex, of course, being everyone's favorite, but they have found many ancient soft tissues, many bones on that, and I think they even have some at the Creation Museum across the way from the Ark encounter. Soft tissue dinosaurs. I don't think they have a T-Rex there. They've got something else. And that's a huge problem. Agreed. It's a huge problem for the narrative that these things are millions of years old, because the soft tissue should not exist. Did they really? Yeah, check it out. It's all over the place. I would recommend. So if we're talking about the Ark encounter, all that's all done by Answers in Genesis. You can look up Answers in Genesis on Google. They'll have all sorts of questions or answers. But a lot of people are skeptical of Answers in Genesis. So if you are, there's a more focused towards the scholarly rather than the layman, and that would be, I would say, check out Institute of Creation Research, ICR. And they'll have all sorts of actual papers, like scientific papers on these sorts of discoveries. And there's tons of it. Tons of examples of this now. We're actually finding more and more, like every year, we're finding more and more soft tissues on dinosaurs. And it really is like one of those unanswered questions. And it's fascinating. Well, I mean, unanswered if you don't believe the Bible's narrative, I guess. Yes, check out, let me make sure it's icr.com, not .org. Okay, ICR.org, Institute of Creation Research, ICR.org. Check it out. It's got all sorts of they'll have a range from like scientific paper down to layman, but they'll talk about it. Soft tissue dinosaurs, all sorts of things. Is there any biblical account of Atlantis? Technically, no, but I'm hopeful. There's a possibility. There's a possibility. And by the way, I'm a big fan of the Ricat structure, the Eye of the Sahara being Atlantis. Like, I'm a big fan of that. I love that. You should check that out on YouTube too. But okay, so what's the deal with Atlantis? We don't know. But what is the legend of Atlantis? How does Atlantis get lost? What is the legend, right? The legend is you have this really advanced society surrounded by, primarily like a main city, right? But you have this society really advanced. We don't know to what degree. I've watched Stargate, right? It's ancient people are traveling the stars and to make, we have all sorts of ideas. But what is like the actual legend is that they're just advanced, and what? The city was destroyed by what? By water. What were we just talking about that happened to the whole world that we had to build a big boat for? And everyone had to start over after that? They'd be awfully primitive by comparison. Yeah, there's a lot of people who say it's natural, there's a lot of people say it's not, and it does have an uncanny resemblance to the accounts the Ricat structure does. So basically, here's what's the deal. So basically, the theory would be is that, and this is not something biblical, this is just me as a fanboy. Alright? There's a distinction. The theory would be is that the legend of Atlantis is a carryover from the survivors of the flood, the family of the flood, that tell their kids, yes, there was once a great city that we used to live in, all these great things. We don't anymore because now we have to start all over again, and it was destroyed by water. And then since then, that legend became what we know as Atlantis. That's not something that we know for sure, but that would be the thing. Now, if you read the Bible, before the flood, so the antediluvian world, the world prior to the deluge, before the flood, in the Bible, it talks about in the genealogies that everyone skips, right? Nobody likes to read. But in the Bible, you actually have this history of not just the names of who had what, who had who for kids. You actually have, and what did those kids do? What were they known for? And they were known for very advanced things. It's a Christian perspective is there's no such thing as cavemen. In fact, we're dumber now than we used to be. That they were actually very smart. And so within like the first 2 generations, they've already figured out animal husbandry. They've already figured out metallurgy. They've already figured out how to build cities. And so according to the Bible, that's all happening before the flood. If you're now in a society post-flood, post-Tower of Babel that is now scattered about the world, you're just a tribe like moving, trying to find a place to live, telling stories of your great-great-grandparents where we didn't used to have to live in this, what would you tell them? We used to live in the city that's ancient and powerful and had all sorts of things we don't have today because we're living off the scraps on the ground. It makes sense that Atlantis, the legend, is a corrupted version of the world prior to, like the legend being corrupted, is of the world before the flood. It makes sense. It's not what the Bible says, but it does make sense. It could fit in the pieces. And that's just, I'm just that's me nerding out over it. But it has the possibility of DNA. If there's no cavemen, what is cave art? So cave art, the idea, okay, it's the cultural idea of cavemen being grunting and being stupid, right? Like just they've got their club and they're banging around and grunting and overall being comical. That doesn't exist. I did mention, though, when people were scattered from the Tower of Babel, they actually scattered and filled the whole world. They spent a lot of time living in temporary shelters like caves. They can make art because they're intelligent, not because they're dumb. When we look at burial grounds for things like Neanderthals, right? Things like that, where people are all like, well, yeah, those guys are, they're cavemen, they're idiots. When we look at them, there's literally nothing different from a society's perspective between them and Homo sapien. They just have a different, we've named it differently because they had a different bone structure, which you can get from DNA. They could interbreed. They were interbreeding. They had they had common all sorts of things. They're doing dental work on each other. They're caring for the young, making dolls, making tools. Like there's no difference between them and Homo sapiens, except for just bone structure, which, you know, you could make the same argument on humans today who have, from different ethnicities, have different bone structure, but we're all still human. We just made an arbitrary line to say, okay, those ones aren't human. I mean, if we can interbreed, you know. But it's, essentially, when I say there's no cavemen in the cultural sense of them being dumb brutes. They would have lived in caves as they traveled. It took a long time to go and walk from the Middle East to the rest of the world. And then, of course, the next question you need to ask is, well, how'd they get to North and South America? Or any of the islands, right? That's the next question that you want to ask. If somebody's saying, well, they walked from one family from that point, and it's in a short amount of time rather than a long amount of time. And that would be basically following the flood. During and after the flood, the tectonic plate movement was a whole lot more violent and fast than it is today. A whole lot. We're talking 1,000 times more rapid movement. And so it actually says in the Bible that God raised, after the flood, God raised the mountains and lowered the seas. So all the flood waters, they went somewhere. They're still here. They just, if you were to flatten the mountains and raise the valleys of the oceans to where it's all flat, you would absolutely have water covering the earth. I think it's like some 120, 130, 40, 50 feet of water across the whole earth. It's just when you raise the mountains, it runs off. When you lower the seas, it runs into there. And so that's tectonic movement. And so basically that all happened. And so while it's going through the process of that, people were able to travel and go across go across from Russia to Alaska and all of that stuff that we can see. It just doesn't have to take millions of years for the process if it's happening rapidly. That's the conversation. Anyway, I get excited. Like this is exciting stuff for me. I'm not trying to be obnoxious or anything like that. Like I just get excited. And when I'm also trying to play the game, it's also like it's difficult to moderate my emotion here. Sorry, as I talk, I can't play, talk, and read at the same time. I agree, the cave art is quite good. I mean, there's all sorts of things that are like different styles. Like I think it's better art than what you see today, most of the time. Cavemen would have been listed in the men of the Bible. Would Neanderthal names also be recorded? And so here's the thing about the Bible when it comes to names. The Bible has a specific purpose for which names are recorded. Numerous times, like we mentioned the Genesis genealogies that have like lists that people skip, right? You know, and in that has interesting stuff. It has the stuff about the cities and things that were built before the flood. So people skip it, yes, but what was I saying? The purpose for writing it is actually in order to show the lineage of a specific human. All the way from Adam, you can now have the lineage all the way from Adam up to, in the Old Testament, up to King David. And then from King David up into the New Testament, you have Jesus. And so you are actually able to follow his line. In those genealogies, a lot of times they'll say, okay, well, this father had this son by this name. That's going to be the son we follow the line. But then it says, and he had other sons and daughters. And it's just, they say, okay, yes, there were others, but we're following a specific line. And that's the purpose of that line. I need to figure out what I'm doing here, though. Problem is, I don't have a lot of wiggle room here. I can kill everything except the giants and still be alive with 16 health, and it doesn't look like that's happening. Oh well. Multitasking has its drawbacks. One of them is not winning Mechabellum matches. That's okay.